Hi. Welcome to RITSEC, week 2. So please sign in. Here's the sign-in link. I'll give you guys a minute or two to sign in, and then we'll go ahead and get started with the this week's topic. Also, just a quick announcement. The demo is pretty big this week. It's a Windows VM, so it's going to be like 30 gigabytes, unfortunately. On Workplace, there's a link you can download it. That's probably going to take some time, so I'd recommend if you want to do the demo this week, go ahead and download it now. Can I get your download started? Also, there's an SSD going around. I have a USB-C to USB cable that you can use. And so look out for that SSD, and you can put it on the computers or your computer.
Raise your hand if you're on the air-gapped computer and don't have internet and need the demo. Okay. All right, so we'll just kind of start going.
Hopefully transfer speeds are good enough, but yeah, just be on the lookout for the SSD.
Two or just one?
We just have one. Oh, that's the SSD. Okay. All right, guys, we're gonna go ahead and get started. All right, so So I guess we're just gonna jump right into it. All right, so week 2 is gonna be Windows this week. So I'm Russell Babarsky. I really like Windows, as my little e-board slide last week showed. But we're just gonna jump right into it. All right, so what is Windows? So I guess something to note is I actually had Sean and Scott throwing memes in this presentation last night, and I did not look at it, so I don't know what is. Oh, okay, that's Micah's Barney apparently. Thank you, Micah. So any pictures in here I did not put in, just an FYI. But so let's talk about Windows. So what is Windows, right? Windows itself is actually a group of graphical operating systems. So when people say Windows, they're referring to the group, but there's specific kinds. So the first is Windows NT, which is like the workstations like these in the slab, and they're really what everyone really refers to when they're talking about Windows. So someone's like, oh yeah, I'm using Windows, probably referring to Windows NT, and that's gonna be the workstation variant. That's also the name of the kernel as well. So the same way that Linux is like the kernel, and people kind of refer to Linux in that regard as like an operating system. Same deal there. So Windows Server is the other really heavily used version of Windows. You're gonna see those in just about every enterprise environment. Active Directory is a really big part of Windows Server. It's like I said, any corporate environment you go into, you're going to see Windows, you're going to see Active Directory. It's a really vital part of really running an organization with a large amount of computers. And we'll talk about why Active Directory is, what's up? Oh, I got a question. Yeah, we'll talk about more down the line why Active Directory is so important and how it's used. And so another type of Windows not really talked about much is Windows IoT. And so Windows IoT can be used with like Raspberry Pis and other embedded devices. But to be honest, I've never really touched too much of Windows IoT, so any questions, you're probably going to have to, I'll just direct to Google because I've really used it much. So I mainly used Windows NT, Windows Server. But kind of a little bit of history on Windows NT is that it was first released in July of 1993. It was deemed Windows NT 3.1 as the first version released. Don't know why they started with 3.1, but now we're up to Windows 10, and I think the build numbers, like build 1803, I believe is the most current version. So that's where we're at today. It's taken a lot of leaps and bounds since then. Also, something important to note is this presentation is going to be focused on more like the modern version of Windows. A lot of stuff I talk about, if you go back to like Windows XP, for example, you're not really going to see some of the stuff I'm talking about, right? Because from Windows XP to Windows Vista, even though really everyone kind of hates on Windows Vista, there's a lot of like big and really good changes to the operating system. So just an important to note. All right, so let's talk about the Windows file system. So I believe Linux, it primarily uses, and correct me if I'm wrong, like ext4 and a bunch of other different Scotch shaking and said yes, a bunch of different other file system types. Windows is mainly just NTFS. And the differences between NTFS and ext4 are, while there are differences, they're pretty minute. The biggest difference is how drives are handled. And so Windows, right, everyone knows like the C drive. So when you go like My Computer and you see the C drive, that's like the classic Windows default drive. And Windows automatically, when it installs this stuff, is going to make your primary partition the C drive. So let's talk about some important directories, just starting off. So the users directory, it's similar to like /home in Linux. You know, /home contains all your user basically all your user directories and your home directories. Windows is the same way. So you can go in there and you go to a specific user, it contains your documents, your pictures, etc. Then we have the Windows directory. And so, and just an important note, these are all like C:/, and so starting from the root drive, just note that's where these files are to be found. But anyways, moving on. So Windows is the default installation, or default folder for the Windows installation. So Windows is always going to be installed here. So it's going to contain critical system files. It's going to contain System32, which contains really like critical DLLs, which are dynamic linked libraries, essentially libraries used by the operating system to run really important programs. So all your critical files are going to be in Windows. And another important note, and we'll kind of talk about, I'll allude to this a little later, but there's like a classic like, oh, go ahead and like delete System32, right? Like there's that classic like meme everyone throws around. That's not really possible in Windows 10. If you just go to like Windows or Windows System32 and right click and delete, it's not going to let you do it. They've had a ton of like protection on top of those files to essentially prevent you from just straight up deleting it, or malware from straight up deleting it. There's a way to get around that obviously, but yeah, by default, you can't go ahead and delete System32. There's protection on it. Just wanted to throw that out there. It's kind of interesting. What else? So program files and program files x86 kind of go hand in hand. So a lot of your default installation, when you install programs, I apologize, are going to be installed in these directories. So if you have a 64-bit operating system or version of Windows, your program files contain all these 64-bit applications that you install. While if you just have like a regular 32-bit operating system, all your 32-bit and 16-bit programs are going to be installed in that directory. So an x86 only really shows up in 64-bit edition of Windows, and that's going to be where all the 32-bit apps are located. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. It's a little bit confusing at first, but essentially 64-bit is the only one, the only extra, has that extra folder. And then program data, really not too important, but is essentially just a folder that is in the root drive that the operating system just has there, and kind of you put data there that you expect to be accessible by just about every user. So whereas like users, you don't want to obviously have other users be accessing the administrator folder. So moving on, let's talk about the registry. Everyone's favorite part of Windows, right? Very easy to understand. Everyone knows the registry. I can just like move on. Yeah, no, the registry is pretty awful in terms of organization. It's not fun looking through it and sifting through it. But for the most part, the biggest thing I see is people kind of fail to recognize what the registry is used for. And the registry, all it is just like configuration options within Windows. So Windows programs will just throw configuration values in here. And you can put in like strings, you can put in ints, you can put in arrays, like binary data as well if you need that. But all these are just configuration options. And like I said, navigating the registry isn't really great. And to be honest, like even sometimes I'm like, okay, like where's this random key? I've used it before, right? But I can't remember for the life of me where it is. So, but there's 5 important root keys within the registry. The first being is the local machine, and that's really, you'll spend, if you're going to be using the registry and like sifting through it by hand, it's probably where you spend most of your time. It's where a lot of the important like computer configuration options are. And if you're like a red teamer, that's where also a lot of like good persistence mechanisms are going to be located. Then there's the current config, which just contains like information at runtime. So every time you restart your computer, this data is going to be different. It can be changed because different things are writing to it at different times. So then you just have classes root, which is just information about like registered applications or installed applications on your system. And then current user has information about the current user. So just stuff that the user basically wants to access throughout their session. It's going to be stored there. And then users, to be frank, it's something related to the current user, but I couldn't find out like some really like great information on exactly what it was used for. So just assume it's used along current user. Any questions moving forward, by the way? What's up?
Is registry editor Windows, or does it come as a Sysinternals package?
Like regedit.
Yeah.
That's a default part of Windows, so it's going to be default in like every Windows installation. Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. All right, so Windows users and groups. So Windows and users are like how they're handled are a lot different than a Unix system, and I guess that's to be expected. But in my opinion, it's a little bit more complex and a little bit more involved. So the first thing that's really important to understand is that a Windows user and a Windows group, they each have what's called a security identifier, and that's short for, basically the shorthand is SID, S-I-D. You'll hear SID, you'll hear SID, mean the same thing, but essentially it's just a string. It usually starts with like S and then dash, and it's going to have like multiple parts separated by dashes. Each of those means something, but not really important right now. It's essentially just a unique string that represents that user or group, and so that's kind of how Windows verifies your permissions when you're like accessing a file or accessing a folder. They check your SID. They're not really going to check your username. I guess that could be directly related to UIDs and GIDs. Again, SIDs are probably more involved. I'm not really sure the underlying mechanisms with UIDs and GIDs, but moving on. So the highest, there are many different like varying permission levels on Windows. So the highest by default, right, is going to be administrators. If you're just on like a local machine, you're going to have your local administrator, which is in the administrators group, which is like the highest privilege. Then you're going to have your regular authenticated users, which is just going to be like default permissions. They're not really going to have a lot. They're going to be able to do a lot in the system, pretty restricting what they can do. But then there's another important account that a lot of you guys, especially if you're just starting learning about Windows, you're not going to know about, and it's the local system account. The local system can basically be attributed to like a root account on Unix. It can do just about everything. In previous versions of Windows, like Windows XP and Windows Server 2003, the system could do like really whatever it wanted. It had like every privilege. It could just basically go ahead and delete all your files, whatever it wanted. In current version of Windows, like Windows 10, the local system account's definitely restricted and hindered in different ways. Through both, what we'll talk about is privileges. They've removed some privileges from system, and they've also basically added another account called Trust Installer, which is a group, which is higher than system. So, but we won't touch too much into that. But essentially, local system is the highest account you can get on Windows. It's like the root account. And that's the really important part. And just to touch on service accounts, so there's like 4 like main service accounts. Like I said, local system, it's a service account. So the real purpose of local system is to actually just run services on your Windows host. And for those not familiar, services in Windows are essentially just programs running really critical parts of the operating system. So like RDP, for example, is run as a service, like your firewall is run as a service. Those are all run as services. And so they rely on these service accounts to perform the actions. So local system, again, a service account, has really high privileges. Local service is another service account, but has really restricted privileges. And Microsoft invented these two to kind of be like, hey, run your services with these accounts, so that way your services aren't doing anything crazy that they shouldn't be able to, or don't have access to stuff that they shouldn't have access to. And Microsoft obviously recommends if your service isn't like system critical, they should be using these two orange accounts right here. And then Trust Installer, I'm not really going to touch too much on it. I already touched on it in terms of it having like higher permissions in system, but there's like more caveats to it, and it's kind of like a rabbit hole, and I could sit here for 15 minutes and talk about it. I'm not going to. It's pretty cool though. I would do some research on it if you get some time. All right. So moving on to user process permissions. So everyone remember a SID from the last slide? Well, the process permissions essentially have what's called a token. And every process is given like an access token that they use to basically verify, hey, I want to access this file. Here's a token. Am I allowed to access it? And the token basically contains really 2 important things that are usually looked at, and that is it's SID, and it can have multiple SIDs, and it can have multiple privileges. SIDs we talked about just represent users and groups, but privileges are a little bit different, and they basically tell the operating system what you're allowed to do and different actions you can take around the operating system. So there's like stuff like take ownership, right? That's a privilege, and you can use that to like take ownership of files. If you have that privilege, then you can just change the ownership of a file. or change the owner of a file to like yourself or another user. But if you don't have that privilege, Windows is not going to let you. So that's an example. And then there's a few other examples of like privileges down here. SE debug name is like a really powerful one, and it's like a red teamer. You'd really want this privilege because it's going to allow you to basically read or write to any memory of like any process that isn't protected. So if you see like a process with like a privilege like this, that's probably not good. But funny enough, by default, administrators get that privilege. So there's something to note. But moving on, assigned primary token is another pretty deadly one because you can just replace process level tokens. So you can just go to another process and be like, hey, this is your token now. So like I said, the take ownership one, you can actually, so in Sysinternals, I was talking about how you couldn't actually delete files directly by just like right clicking and delete. You actually would have to take ownership of all those files first and give yourself permission to do so. But if you have the SE take ownership privilege, you can just do that, take ownership of all the files and delete them. So then obviously deleting your operating system. The last privilege, TCP name, is essentially you just act as part of the operating system. So if you have this privilege, you're essentially local system at this point. That's kind of a confusing one. I won't go too much into that, but that's definitely one to look out for. I don't think I'm missing anything, but I guess the important part of user process permissions is just remember that you have an access token, and that is how you verify who you are, right? As citizen privileges. So those are really two important things to take from this slide. Any questions moving on? Cool. Okay. Oh, right. I forgot the spawn part. So iCackles is a command line tool. We'll talk about the command line a little bit down, a couple slides from now. But iCackles is a great command line tool to essentially check permissions or ownership of a file. So it'll give you really good information in the command line about the details of who can access the file and what privileges they have. Or permissions, I'm sorry. All right, so just a quick note on user access control. I'll try to go quick on this one because this one's a little bit, I don't know. I'm not really happy with this slide. But everyone's probably like seen UAC. If you like go on your home computer, if you have like Windows in front of you on your laptop, you just like right click a program and run as administrator, it's gonna be like, oh hey, like do you want to run this app on your computer, or do you want to trust this app, or I don't know the text, like no one really reads it, everyone's just like yes. But essentially that's a feature called UAC, and that feature was implemented through a big program that Microsoft implemented in Vista called User Interface Privilege Isolation. Really confusing name, not really too important that you know the name. Essentially, the important part to remember is that it kind of implemented a system with integrity levels that you couldn't talk down, or sorry, lower integrity levels couldn't talk up to higher integrity levels. So essentially every process has an integrity level. When you log in as like a regular user, you have a medium integrity level. If you're running a program as an administrator, you have a high integrity level. There's like a system and protected integrity level, which are usually only used by really critical processes. And then you have low and untrusted, which are usually used by like programs that are implementing some sort of sandbox, or you're like a guest user. So the important thing to note about UAC and really the user interface privilege isolation again is that the low privilege, or the low integrity, I apologize, can't talk to the medium integrity. So if you wants to edit, like inject into memory or something like that, it's not going to be allowed to because of that protection with the integrity levels. So, and I put protected in green. Protected basically essentially has to do with protected processes within Windows. That's like a whole, I gave like a talk on that essentially because they're pretty complex, but essentially Windows has certain processes that are protected on the system, and this prevents people from really interfering with like critical system processes like LSAS, which is like what authenticates you, like WinLogon, another process helps with authentication, like all those really critical processes. You can't really interfere with them. You can't inject into memory because they're protected. So, but again, won't go too much into that. Oh yeah, and UAC, again, elevates you from medium integrity to high integrity. So when you're clicking that UAC box and you're clicking yes, you're essentially saying, yeah, I want to go to a high integrity to run as administrator. And this is why UAC bypasses, when you see them in security news, they're somewhat important because without UAC, you're kind of allowed to, you can like remotely, it's very easy to remotely escalate yourself to administrator as like a medium integrity process. So, any questions moving on? Cool. All right, so file permissions. Why is there a brick wall? Who put the? I don't know. Maybe I'm not catching the joke, but so each file has its like own permissions. Essentially, how they're broken down is you have ACLs, which are just access control lists, and access control lists are made up of ACEs, and those stand for access control entries. And so every access control entry is going to have like a SID, and it tells you what the SID can and can't do. So here's like your basic permissions down here at the bottom. So you have read, write, list fuller contents, read and execute, modify, and full control. Obviously, full control is going to give you all the permissions. Read and write, pretty self-explanatory, very similar to like Linux style, right? If you can read the file, you can just read the contents of it. If you can write to it, and you can write to it. So list folder contents is kind of an interesting one. It essentially just gives you read and execute privileges on the back end, but essentially allows you to view if it's a folder, allows you to view the folder contents. Read and execute just gives you read and execute privileges, and I realized I forgot execute privileges on here, but there's also execute too, so just make note of that. Lastly, modify. Users just able to write, read, and traverse. So it's kind of like a step below full control. And then full control, you just get all the permissions, like I said. And so something else to note is there's also a bunch of like special privileges. So if you are like going to a file in Windows, you right click properties, and then you go to like security, and then click advanced, you're gonna see like this big menu where you can configure all these options for like each different user and set each different ACE. I think if you go to, you can see the special permissions. There's a button like in that menu somewhere where it'll show like 25 or 30 like different permissions that you can set. You really shouldn't ever have to mess around with those, but just know that they're there, and changing these different options will set different ones in that special menu. So, any questions moving on? Oh, okay, cool. All right, cool. Oh my God. So the command line, it feels kind of crappy and it kind of feels old, but it's still pretty powerful. There's a lot of like great information you can still get from it. So it's basically just this DOS batch language, which people just call batch. Again, it's a really old. It's been around since, I don't even really know, like 10, 15, 20, 30 years. It's been around for a while, but kind of feels like Bash's like younger brother essentially. But some Linux basic commands with like their Linux equivalents, because I know we just talked about Linux last week. So first, dir, and it's pretty much just ls in Linux. So dir will just give you the folder contents. And another important thing to note is when you're actually using these commands in the command line, instead of passing like -a for like list all the folder or all the files within the directory, if you do like it would be like /a in Windows. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but essentially it's a little bit of different like syntax on the command line for the command line. Moving on, something I think a lot of people miss is type, and type is essentially cat in Windows, and allow you to just read a file's contents. So which is essentially where in Unix, so it'll just tell you the location of a file. So if you do which CMD in the command line, it'll essentially give you the location of CMD on the file system. So it's always a fun one if you're looking for specifically a binary in Windows that's in the path. Find is similar to grep. You can find like text in documents, but you can also use it to find documents around the file system. I will be honest, find is not as good as grep though. Grep is much more powerful and much easier to use, but find's still there. Move is essentially just MV, just moves a file or folder. CLS is just clear, and another command I actually forgot to put on here. I can't believe I forgot to put it on here, but it was net. The net command suite is, you can really do a lot of powerful things on the system. So a classic one, to see all the users on the system, if you do net space users, that's going to show you all the users on the system. If you do net space share, it's going to show you all the shares that are on the system. If you just do like net, it'll show you all the different commands you can use with net. So I would check that one out. That's a pretty powerful one. And if you're like in an incident response competition or red teaming, blue teaming, you're going to definitely want to know how to use net. So I just threw in some great resources. So in Workplace, if you go to Workplace and view the slides and click on these resources, they're really great for kind of picking up a few different commands on the command line. So, all right, so PowerShell, everyone's favorite, right? So this was essentially, in my opinion, like Microsoft's answer to Bash. When PowerShell started out, honestly, in my opinion, it was not very good. It was pretty underwhelming, didn't really do a whole lot. But since PowerShell, I think it's in version 5 now, honestly, there's so many features and so many different commands. I would say it's right up there with Bash in terms of usability, especially for Windows systems. They also made it cross-platform, so if you're on Linux, you can use PowerShell too, because everyone's going to do that. But essentially, it's built on the .NET framework, which is just like an open-source platform that allows you to do like an object-oriented way of interacting with the Windows API, which is like kind of the underlying Windows C++ stuff, but we won't go too much into that. PowerShell is very verbose, but also really powerful. And like I said, it's kind of Microsoft's answer to Bash, so they threw a lot at it and gave it a lot of functionality. And unlike a native Windows system, you can script a lot of different things. I, over the summer at my co-op, worked a lot with PowerShell, wrote a lot of different scripts in it. So like in an enterprise environment where it's a Windows-heavy network, you're going to be using PowerShell a lot. And it's really easy to kind of pick up as well. They provide like all these really great commands to kind of get you familiar with PowerShell. So git command just allows you to basically explore different commandlets or commands that they have on the system. So if you did like git command and like space, like git dash star or asterisk, that's going to basically show all the commands that begin with git dash. So it's an easy way to start familiarizing yourself with the different commands that are on PowerShell. Git help will allow you to see more information about the command. I would relate this to like man pages on Linux. So if you just do git help, git service, it's just going to give you some information on this, what git service does, what it returns, the different parameters you can pass to it, et cetera, et cetera. And then if you do a command, so for again, like git service, and then pipe it to git member, it'll allow you to see what object is returned and kind of have a better understanding of how you can use that object. I don't think I really talked about this too much, but PowerShell is based all around objects, where Bash is more based around text. So when you run commands in PowerShell, they're going to be returning objects most of the time. And those objects can be manipulated in different ways. So kind of similar to like, I don't really want to say Java because I feel like I'm getting down like a slippery slope there, but essentially you can manipulate those objects and do like, if it's like a string object, right, you could do like dot, shoot, now I can't remember like the different things you could do to manipulate string, but yeah, so it's all going to be based around objects, and you can use different command line tools to manipulate those objects. So two really important functions that you should really get yourself familiar with when you're trying to use PowerShell is for each object and where object. My manager on my last co-op famously said that if you understand these two, you can be really effective in PowerShell. Or it's more along the lines of, if you know these two commands, you pretty much know PowerShell. The for each is essentially like replaces like for loops and pretty much all loops within PowerShell. So you don't really have a reason to do like for or like like a classic C style for loop. Just use for each object. It's going to be a lot quicker and a lot easier to kind of write and utilize. And then where object is going to filter output from commands. So you could do where object, and then based off of what is passed into it, you can filter based off that input. And the important thing with these commands is the $_ underscore. So $_ is basically going to represent the object that for each object or where object is manipulating or iterating through. So in this example, we have git service, and it's piped into for each object. And then in the loop, we have the money underscore, and that's essentially saying like, do something with this object, right? So it's going to represent each service on the box. So does that make sense? Is that clear to everyone? Is there any questions on PowerShell before I move on? No? Okay, cool. Active Directory. All right, so I know I briefly touched on Active Directory beforehand, but Active Directory is really like a critical core part of Windows operating system as a whole, and especially Windows Server. So if you go into like any enterprise environment, I promise you, like your first co-op, your second co-op, probably going to be running Active Directory in some form. I even heard of like mostly Linux networks still running Active Directory because it's a really powerful system and allows you to really easily organize data and computers around the network. So as a whole, Active Directory starts when you install it in like a Windows server. It's going to create what's called like a forest, and the forest is like an overarching, like your top level container that's going to contain what's called domains. So when you install Active Directory, you're going to be asked to basically specify a domain name, and that's going to be how your computers are going to basically stay connected, is through that domain. And it's like a tree-like structure. So again, the forest is on the top, and then you have domains, and then from the domains, you're going to have like users, groups, computers within those domains. So, and Active Directory really allows easy management of like all these systems or users. So you can go in to a user and specify certain groups with Active Directory, set certain permissions on the groups, and then you could even specify hey, I want these users to only be able to access this computer at this specific time. So it really allows you more fine-grained control over a large group of computers, whereas if you were just using computers manually, you'd have to go around to each different computer and manage those, which would be a real pain, especially in a large-scale enterprise environment. So Active Directory is very good at those large-scale enterprise environments. So, one last thing. You'll probably see this at some point in the near future, especially if you go on co-op, maybe next summer. You're probably going to see some mention of Active Directory Azure. So this is Microsoft's implementation of basically Active Directory in the cloud, and this allows remote management of Active Directory, so you don't have to have a Active Directory or domain controller, which is what Active Directory is installed on premise. You could just have Active Directory Azure with all your users up in the cloud, and Microsoft manages it all. All that infrastructure is all managed by Microsoft. And I feel like Microsoft has been pushing more and more for people to start using Azure, especially for mail and Active Directory. So you'll probably see that at your co-ops. You'll see Azure and Active Directory Azure. So just something to note. So, So more important things to note with Active Directory is that these new groups are added. So because you're now managing a bunch of computers, you're going to need new groups to kind of specify what privileges people need to log into all these different computers and manage different parts of the Active Directory and the configuration options. So enterprise admins is just going to be the highest level of the privilege in the forest. So again, that forest is that big overarching container, contains all the domains. So enterprise admin is the new administrator account in an Active Directory, highest level privilege. And then domain administrator is just going to be the highest privilege in a domain. To be frank, domain administrator and enterprise administrator, not much is different from them, except for the fact that enterprise can access different domains. But to be frank, it's rare you see multiple domains in a forest. So, or at least in my experience, I have not seen that very much. So domain admin and enterprise admin are usually pretty much identical in terms of their privilege and what they can access. So if you're a red teamer, you really want the domain admin account. That's your go-to goal, because once you get domain admin, you can access any computer around the network unless you're specifically restricted against it. And even then, you could change that privilege because you just log into the domain controller and say, I want to access all computers around the network, and it'll, you can then log in remotely to all the computers. So domain admin is a super powerful account, and a lot of companies really put a lot of effort in protecting this account, domain admin accounts. DNS admins, they just have admin access to DNS services. So DNS is automatically, I forgot to mention this, but DNS is automatically installed with Active Directory. It's kind of they go hand in hand. So if you're a DNS admin, you can kind of access that service and do different configuration options on that service. Schema admins essentially just have full control over how the database in Active Directory is structured and how the different containers are structured. And then domain users is just your regular user that, say, Tammy in HR is going to log into using her domain user account. It doesn't have any special privileges. Essentially, can just log into, by default, can log into every computer, but has really low privileges and isn't going to be able to do much. All right, so group policy. So group policy is another feature of Active Directory. By default, it's on your workstations here. These all have group policy. Actually, this is a bad example because they're part of a domain. But if you go home on your laptop and you want to edit group policy, you can. It's local on your system, but group policy is really meant for managing like a lot of computers around the network and providing specific configuration options to them. So there's like an estimated like 5,000 plus GPO settings. So it gives you a lot of like really fine-grained control over different computers on the network. So just as some examples, you can restrict local admin accounts. So like I said, those new admin groups get created when you set up Active Directory. There's domain admin and enterprise admin accounts. So with these GPO settings, you can essentially say, hey, these local administrator accounts don't really mean anything anymore. People can't use them. Only really respect the domain admins or enterprise admins. You can also restrict certain programs based off the name. So that's another feature. You can just go in and say, hey, I don't want people running like CMD. So you can remove access to that specific program by its name. Obviously, if the binary name changes, then it will not block it anymore. But still a useful feature. You can disable control panel, and you can disable task manager using GPO. So just some fun little things you can do. Again, 5,000 plus GPO settings. They're not really all documented super well, I believe. So definitely worth investing in there. Sort of like the registry in the way that it's not structured, but in the way it's like a maze kind of operating through, because there's so many different parts. So it's cool to check out though. So Sysinternals Tools. What's the time, Micah? 12:48. All right. I think I have time for like a quick demo of Process Explorer. We'll see how it goes. Demos never really go super well for me, but oh well. So anyways, Sysinternals Tools are like a large group of tools that a guy named Mark Russovich, that's bad pronunciation, but close enough. He essentially made all these different tools and was managing these tools until Microsoft kind of bought his company out, and now they're just called Sysinternals Tools. And they're a set of tools that basically extend the functionality of, or give system administrators more power over their Windows systems through a variety of great tools. So the first is like Process Explorer, which is really just a way better task manager. So if you're in like an incident response competition and red team's attacking you, you're going to want to be looking at Process Explorer. Give you a lot of great insight into the processes that are running on your system. It can also provide you like detailed information on like the access tokens, like we talked about earlier, like different services that are running, and like the different privileges like each process token has, just for example. So Process Explorer really gives you more fine-grained information on the system. So Procmon, it's a great tool for debugging. I use it a lot when I'm like writing Windows applications, but if you're not really writing stuff, not super useful, and it's pretty vocal in terms of the information it spits out. So it spits out a lot of information at you. But Access Check is basically a better version of the program I talked about earlier, which is iCackles. It just gives you more readable information readable information on the privileges or the permissions on a file. PsExec, we'll talk about this one in the next slide, but essentially allows you to execute commands remotely. So if you have proper credentials, you can just log into an account with PsExec and get like a command shell and start like running commands on the system. And then Sysmon is a really great logging tool and gives you the ability to forward logs to like different locations, or so if you have like a log aggregation tool or a seam, you can use Sysmon to forward logs to that seam and also get more logs from your Windows system. So it's really great if you work in a SOC, you're gonna see this tool used like 100%. And then TCP View is just a GUI version of Netstat. Probably provides more features, but I really just use Netstat in the command line. So, what's up?
Shameless plug-in. We'll do this at Guardians later this semester. Also, if you become a ninja at this toolkit, it's really hard for Red Team to hide.
Yeah.
It is really, really, really good.
Yeah, I really recommend sitting down and kind of familiarizing yourself with these tools.
I spent a lot of time using this toolkit to try to find my own malware, and it's really hard to hide from it. So.
Yeah. And it really hard in general. It's really hard if you're writing malware, it's really hard to hide from these tools, like Ben said. And in general, in the Windows system, it's really hard to hide. So, yeah, good addition, Ben. Appreciate it. What's up?
Question about Procmon specifically. Whenever it says that it sees like register changes, is that referring to the Windows registry or the actual like physical registers on a CPU?
No. So it's are you talking about like the reg query,
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are going to be actual registry edits. So in the registry, not like registers.
Okay.
So any other questions? Oh, cool. All right. So I'll do a Process Explorer demo at the end. We'll talk about PsExec now, and then we'll do a quick demo. I'm a little nervous about the demo. But so PsExec is essentially the closest thing Windows will ever get to SSH. Sorry, pre-Windows 10, because I guess Windows 10 now has the ability for you to download like Bash and have Bash on the system. But before Windows 10, PsExec was great, and it was the closest thing we'll ever get to SSH. But essentially allows you to execute commands remotely on a system through the command line, or really you can execute any program. So like here's like a basic usage, right? It's PsExec, and then note the 2 backslashes in front of the IP address. That is important. So then you put the IP address and then the user and the program you want to execute, and then it'll ask you for a password. Enter the correct password. You can execute that program on the system. So an important thing to note also about PsExec, if you have the proper credentials, say if you're like administrator user, if like Babarsky is an administrator user on the box or a domain administrator, he's going to be able to create a service and actually get a system, a local system level shell. So he can get like the highest privilege as just an administrator. So PsExec is oftentimes used for that as well. So there's PowerShell versions as well. So I believe there's like invoke PsExec or something along those lines that is also really useful if you're more leaning towards creating like a scriptable PsExec in PowerShell. And then here's just like a fun example of what you can do to your friends in the lab if they're like working on something. You know, if they're working on like a Google Doc that's really important or a Word document, you can just like shut down the computer remotely because all the passwords are the same and the users are the same on all the systems. You can just run that command. So don't actually do that to your friends. Don't be rude. Don't do that to me, especially. I'll be mad. Okay, let's do Process Explorer demo. So this is Process Explorer. If you go to like, I believe I provided the link in the slides, but it's live.sysinternals.com. If you go to that address or just Google that, you can find all Sysinternal Tools at that address. You could also just download the Sysinternals suite, which will give you all the tools as well, like a conveniently packed up zip. So let's open this up. All right, cool. So I don't believe I'm running this as administrator. Let me run it as administrator real quick. And here's UAC, like I was talking about. Anyway, so this is what Process Explorer looks like when you open it up. You see like lots of really cool colors, and you're like, wow, this looks fun. But there's a lot of cool different things you can do. So we'll go down here, and we'll go down to like, heck, we'll just check out the Process Explorer program itself. So you can click on, double click on it, and it's going to provide you with like all this information on the process. So I won't go through obviously like all of this because it's a lot, but you can get performance details, security information, which is really valuable. So it can tell you the user, the SID of that user, the session they're on, and then here's the privileges down here like we were talking about before. Information on the different threads, and yeah, really helpful tool, which I'll just show you guys right now, is if you're like in a red team, blue team competition and you want to check for any malicious binaries around the system, an easy like gotcha for the blue team is if you just go to, I believe it's view, oh, I'm not going to remember where to get this. It's options, sorry. And if you go to options and then verify image signatures, this little column is going to appear, and it's going to show you if the cert on the binary that's signed by is actually valid, or the signature on the binary is valid. So like all these are valid. They're signed by Microsoft. They're good, obviously. They're not malicious. But if like a program said like invalid or like no signature, right, it's going to pop up and give you a pretty obvious warning that, hey, this is a little sketch because this binary isn't signed, or the publisher of the binary isn't really validated. That's bad. You might want to look into that. So that's like an easy gotcha for blue team in instant response competitions. So.
What was that again? The options?
Sorry, yeah, I'll go through that one more time. So you just go to options and then verify image signatures. So, cool. Any other questions? Anything else you want to really see in Process Explorer? You guys are interested? Okay, cool. Well, that's Windows for you. That's like a brief overview. If you guys have any questions, feel free to come up and talk to me. I talk about Windows all the time. I do Windows stuff all the time. So yeah, just feel free to approach me if you see me in the labs, whatever. Just come up and talk to me. I'd be more than happy to talk to you or share any information I have with you guys. So cool. Thank you guys for listening. I appreciate it.